It's no secret that Andromeda did not meet the expectations of many people, whether they were fans of the series or part of the massive outrage bandwagon. Yesterday, Kotaku published an article which details the story behind BioWare Montreal's 5 rocky years working on the game. A lot of the information makes perfect sense and draws direct lines to the shortcomings of the final product. Hey guys, JV here sharing my thoughts on Kotaku's article. If you haven't read it yet, I've left a link in the description below. As always, if you like what I do here and want to see more, be sure to subscribe. The story begins with pre-production and the planning phase of the next Mass Effect game, and the original plan, which was conceived by heads of BioWare shortly after Mass Effect 3 back in 2012, 5 years ago, was to have hundreds of explorable planets that you could actually land on and explore. And the inspiration for that was to deliver on the promises that they made with the original game, but just couldn't fulfill, whether it was to the scope of the project or maybe the technology was not there. They wanted to deliver on the promises of actually exploring in a space RPG. And with that came the ability to pilot your ship. No longer would there just be loading screens, you would actually pilot it around and land on these planets. And of course, in order to achieve hundreds of explorable planets, they would need to be procedurally generated. If this makes you think of No Man's Sky, then you're not alone. It's referenced several times in the article, but these concepts were conceived separately. There is no connection because neither company came out and announced what they were working on, specifically with the procedurally generated hundreds of planets with piloting your own ship. Down the line, they discovered that the tech was too difficult for many of the teams to handle. They didn't have the manpower or the resources, and in fact, they didn't find the mechanic of exploring these hundreds of procedurally generated worlds all that fun. This discovery did lead to a decision, but this wasn't decided until after a certain point where significant time and resources were wasted on this very broad, big idea that didn't actually make it into the game. The amount of explorable planets was downsized to 30, and then at a later time, what we have in the actual game, 7. So we went from hundreds to 30 to 7. And so the scope of the project, as it usually does change over the development cycle, was changed significantly with this game. This was one of several decisions that resulted in an internal schism that caused many issues for BioWare down the line. Speaking of internal troubles, there were several different lead changes on the project, and people that came in were on the project for an extended period of time and then left, and they had to be replaced. And ultimately, we were left with Mac Walters, who was a writer on the original trilogy, at the helm. According to the anonymous developers that, contributed to this piece on Kotaku, Mac Walters was the one who brought the vision together for the final product, the game that we have in our hands today, but at a very late stage. And it's repeated several times in the article that the game that we have that released on March 21st of 2017 was really developed, the bulk of it, over 18 months, which is, if you compare it to a lot of other development cycles, a very small amount of time. During all these leadership changes, there was a political divide forming between BioWare Edmonton and Montreal, and allegedly, developers were leached to work on Project Dylan, which is the new IP at Edmonton headed by Casey Hudson, which, if you remember, was the executive producer on the original trilogy. As a result, BioWare Montreal lost several developers from different departments working on Andromeda, and those people allegedly were never replaced. So they had less people working across several different teams, and that lack of manpower caused an extreme crunch, long hours down the stretch to, ship this game. Furthermore, there are claims that the Frostbite Engine caused a lot of trouble for BioWare, and that it's always been challenging for them, starting with Dragon Age Inquisition. As we know, Frostbite was created by DICE, who makes the Battlefield games, and they run very well. It's very good at what it does best, and that makes sense. However, it's not great at handling huge open worlds, animations, or RPG systems. It is great at combat and vehicle mechanics, and of course, those are two of the main parts that a lot of people enjoyed about Andromeda. The combat was very smooth and slick, and the vehicle, the Nomad, was much better than the Mako. To me, this sounds like EA was forcing Frostbite down their throats and trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, because these systems, these RPG systems, needed to be built out for Andromeda, and they were not necessarily taken from Dragon Age Inquisition because the production of both of these games overlapped. Some things must have been shared between these studios, but we know for certain that a lot of these RPG systems, managing your party and your inventory, things like that, had to be built out separately. So a lot of these engine troubles resulted in the story, writing, and cinematics work starting a lot later than was planned, than it should have gone down. And I think it's very clear to see that, because when you look at a lot of the shortcomings of the game, according to a lot of people, they'll say bad story, bad writing, bad cinematics animation. It's very clear to see that. Additionally, there was a late decision from higher-ups in BioWare, not necessarily those that worked on the game, to switch the software used to create animations, which is very frustrating, I'm sure, even though some of the old work used in the previous software was still put into the final product. So, long story short, there was a lot of wasted work, resulting in outsourcing for animation and a variety of different technology and softwares being used in the final game. Finally, the article touches on this internal review process where the developer builds out a significant portion of the game, sends it to an independent entity, and they look at it and project a meta score for the game, because as we know, reviews really do rule a lot of the incentives for publishers and developers. And so this review institution projected an 80 to 85 meta score months ahead of the launch of the game. That was enough for BioWare to say, you know what, we're going to go ahead with this launch. We're not going to do a major rescope or anything like that. So they finalized their plans for the EA Access launch and the March release date. And this is the point of the story where everyone knows what happened. The game came out on EA Access a little bit early. People pointed out many issues, including the animation, and I felt the portion of the game that was offered in the 10-hour trial was not great either. I felt like it should have been another portion of the game because it wasn't super representative of the rest of the game. And so animation GIFs and, that being viral and the poor timing led to a really rocky launch for BioWare Montreal. After the EA Access period, the reviews hit for the launch of the game, and they were much lower than that projection, about 10 to 15 points. And this led, as we know, to EA moving Montreal devs around to other studios to work on other games, and unfortunately putting the Mass Effect franchise on hold for the moment. So that was my general summary of what was shared in the article. A lot of really interesting stuff, and if you want more detail, you definitely need to read it for yourself. I had several takeaways after first reading this article, but the one that has stuck with me is that game development for the ones actually making the game, not the higher ups, the publisher making the, high concept decisions, it's so hard. It is not easy. And I think that's something that we take for granted, especially with the people putting in very long hours grinding out to get these games out on time. That being said, the game did release in an unacceptable, unfinished state. And it's hard to take a lot of the folks that put their heads down and grind on this thing for years accountable. Those are not the people that I would necessarily be upset with after reading this. It would be the higher ups. It would be the publishers. It would be the people pushing for this hardline release date, even though we had several years of significant changes in scope and vision. Changing scope is something we hear a lot about with video game development. It happens with almost every single game. Usually it's a broader idea that gets scaled down because you can't achieve it with the time, the manpower, maybe the technology at the moment. What you don't hear a lot about, though, is political divides within larger developers and people leeching developers from one studio to another and then not getting replaced. But those people that are still left are expected to still finish out the product. It just makes me feel bad for those people expected to deliver on something when they weren't really given the tools to succeed. Another main takeaway for me was drawing the lines between these struggles and what we actually had in the final product. And as I mentioned, a lot of the engine troubles, internal lead changes, and pre-production changes in scope led to the story, the writing, and the cinematics animation work starting far too late in production. It really is like connecting the dots here. What are the three main things that the game was critiqued for? It is the story and the Andromeda Initiative and the writing. A lot of people found it to be a little silly, B-movie-like, just what the hell is this shitty writing? A lot of harsh criticism on that front. And then the cinematics, the animation, the dead faces, the lack of emotion, and comparing it to Inquisition, a game that came out 3 years before. I was part of the camp that looked at their previous release and thought, How is this worse than your previous game? That is not how this stuff is supposed to work. And of course, when we hear about overlapping production and additional issues with the animation and it having to be outsourced, it makes a lot of sense that something internally was messed up because there was so much opportunity for mistakes to be made. Long story short, this Kotaku article paints a perfect picture for how Andromeda turned out. It makes me concerned for the future of BioWare and their games. Regardless of if it was Montreal or Edmonton, this article clearly lines out that there were issues between the two. and I don't want that to bleed into Project Dylan, but I'm going to be cautious. It also makes me concerned for other EA games under different studios where they force them to use Frostbite. It just doesn't seem like a good idea. I mean, we're 0 for 2 on this with RPGs. And what I mean by that is from the developer standpoint. I don't mean that Inquisition was not a fine game or Andromeda was terrible or anything like that. We have, anonymous sources here, developers working on the game, saying that Frostbite has always been challenging for BioWare. It has never been easy to work with, and it has always caused problems. Overall, I'm just disappointed. It's just sad. It's troubling, and I hate that it happened to one of my favorite franchises. My only hope is that BioWare can be put back on the right track with Mass Effect, whether it's a few years or longer down the line, have the right tools, have the right vision, and everything in place. I mean, for a franchise this popular and this big, I don't know how EA and the heads of BioWare could fuck up this badly. I mean, they really did. This is a recipe for a disaster, at least what's outlined in this article. It's actually miraculous that they were able to cobble together all of these broken pieces and ship the game in the way it was shipped. It's actually impressive in a sad, depressing sort of way. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below on this article. I mean, this is some really hard-hitting stuff. We usually don't get insight like this, and several developers were willing to be anonymous but share their true experience with developing this game. So I'd love to hear what you're thinking about this article in the comment section below. If you're still watching and you enjoy the video, click the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook so you don't miss another video. Sign up with Juniper to receive exclusive discounts on shirts, hoodies, and more at the JV merch store. Click the link in the description below for more details. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.